In this episode, we are looking at the small settings on a small office home office, SOHO, router that can make a very large security difference. For many beginners, the router feels like a box that simply makes the internet work. So once it is plugged in and the wireless network appears, it is easy to assume the job is done. The problem is that the router is one of the most important trust points in the whole environment because it sits between local devices and the outside world, and it helps decide how traffic enters, leaves, and gets managed. If the router is left with weak settings, default passwords, careless wireless setup, open ports, or loose remote management, then the entire network can become easier to misuse even when the computers and phones on that network seem fine on their own. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is by understanding what the router is really doing in a home or small office. It is not just passing traffic around. It is helping connect laptops, phones, printers, cameras, tablets, and other devices to the internet, while also creating the local network those devices share with each other. That means the router becomes the front door for many basic security decisions, including who can manage the network, how wireless users join it, what outside traffic is blocked, and what special paths are opened on purpose. For a beginner, this matters because the router often gets less attention than the laptop, even though a weak router can affect every device behind it. When the router is configured well, it helps create a safer foundation. When it is configured poorly, it can quietly weaken everything connected to it. One of the most common mistakes in a SOHO environment is leaving the router with default credentials. Many routers ship with a standard administrative username and password so they can be set up quickly the first time, but those starting values are not meant to stay in place forever. If they are left unchanged, anyone who knows the brand and model may have a much easier time getting into the management settings than the owner realizes. For a beginner, the important lesson is that the password used to manage the router is not the same thing as the password used to join the wireless network. The router may be protecting all the devices in the house or office, yet the management side of it could still be using a password that many people can look up. That is an avoidable risk because it gives away control of the network instead of requiring real permission to make changes. Changing the router's administrative credentials should be one of the first security steps after setup, and it should be treated as a serious control rather than a minor cleanup task. If someone gains access to the management screen, they may be able to change the wireless password, weaken security settings, redirect traffic, open risky ports, or lock out the real owner. That is why the management password needs to be strong, unique, and kept separate from the everyday wireless password shared with trusted users. In a small office or home, people sometimes reuse the same easy password for everything because it feels convenient, but that habit creates a weak point at the exact place that matters most. A technician should explain this in simple terms. The router controls the network, so the password that protects the router should be stronger and more carefully guarded than one used for ordinary daily convenience. Another setting beginners need to understand is the network name, which is called the Service Set Identifier, SSID. The SSID is the wireless network name that users see when they look for Wi-Fi, and while it may seem like a minor cosmetic detail, it still matters. A weak or careless SSID choice can reveal more information than it should, such as the family name, apartment number, business name, or other details that make the environment easier to identify. For example, if the network name clearly shows the company name, the exact address, or the owner's identity, that gives away useful clues to anyone nearby. A safer approach is to choose a name that is clear enough for the intended users to recognize, but not so specific that it advertises personal or business details to strangers. The SSID is not the main defense, but it is part of how the network presents itself to the outside world. The wireless setup behind that SSID matters even more than the name itself. A SOHO router should not be left with an open wireless network or a weak shared password that neighbors, visitors, or random people can guess easily. When beginners think about wireless security, They often focus only on whether the signal reaches every room, but security matters just as much as convenience. A wireless password should be strong enough that it is not based on easy words, common patterns, or simple personal details someone else could guess. The reason is straightforward. If an unauthorized person joins the wireless network, they are no longer just outside the house or office. They are now on the local network, closer to shared devices, local services, and the router itself. A strong wireless setup helps keep that first boundary in place so only trusted users get inside. It also helps to think about who really needs access to the main wireless network and who does not. In a home or very small office, people often give the main wireless password to guests, delivery workers, short-term visitors, or anyone who asks because it feels polite and easy. The problem is that once the main password is shared widely, the network becomes harder to control. Even if every guest means well, the environment becomes less private and less predictable because more devices are now joining the same trusted space as business systems, family computers, or shared printers. If the router supports a separate guest network, that can be a cleaner choice because it lets visitors get internet access without placing them directly inside the main network used for more sensitive activity. The beginner lesson is simple. Not everyone needs the same level of access, and the router should reflect that instead of treating every wireless device as equally trusted. The firewall is another major router feature that beginners need to understand in plain language. A firewall helps control what traffic is allowed to pass and what traffic should be blocked based on rules and context. In a SOHO router, that usually means the firewall helps prevent unwanted outside traffic from reaching devices on the inside unless there is a good reason to allow it. This matters because most users do not want random outside systems contacting home laptops, office printers, storage devices, or cameras directly. The router's firewall creates a protective barrier that makes the local network less exposed. When people disable firewall protections or leave them in a weak state just to solve a short-term connectivity problem, they may remove one of the most valuable safety layers on the entire network. A technician should explain that the firewall is not just another menu option. It is part of what keeps the local environment from being too easy to reach from the outside. Ports are where this topic often becomes confusing for beginners. So the simplest way to understand them is to think of them as specific pathways used by different network services. Not every path should be open all the time, and not every device inside the network should be reachable from the outside internet. A well-locked SOHO router keeps most of those outside paths closed unless there is a real need to open one. That is why open ports matter. An open port is not automatically dangerous by itself, but it does create a reachable path that may expose a device or service to more attention and more risk. If a router has unnecessary ports opened, it may be allowing outsiders to interact with something inside the network that never needed outside contact in the first place. The more unneeded paths are opened, the more chances there are for misuse, mistakes, or attacks. Port forwarding is one of the main ways open ports appear on a small network, and this is where beginners need to slow down and ask what the setting is really doing. Port forwarding tells the router to take traffic coming from the outside and send it to a specific device or service inside the network. Sometimes there is a real reason for that, but many times the setting gets added casually to make one app, one camera, one game, or one remote tool work faster without fully thinking through the risk. The problem is that forwarding a port is like cutting a special path through the router's outer barrier and pointing that path at something inside. If that internal device is weak, outdated, or poorly secured, the open path may become the reason it gets exposed. A beginner technician does not need to fear every port setting, but that technician should understand that opening a port is a trust decision, not just a convenience setting. This is why a strong SOHO router setup should avoid unnecessary open ports and review any forwarded ports with care. If a service is no longer needed, the forwarded path should not remain open just because nobody got around to cleaning it up. In many homes and small offices, ports get open once for a project or a test, and then stay there for months or years without anyone checking whether the reason still exists. That creates quiet risk because the router continues offering access long after the user forgot the setting was there. The safer habit is simple. Open only what has a clear need, know which device the opening points to, and remove the opening when that purpose is gone. Good router security is often about reducing leftovers. The network becomes safer when old convenience settings do not stay in place longer than the real need that created them. Remote management is another setting that deserves extra care because it controls whether the router can be managed from outside the local network. For beginners, the easiest way to think about this is to ask who should be able to reach the router's settings screen. In most SOHO environments, the answer is usually people already inside the trusted local network, not random outside locations across the internet. If remote management is enabled carelessly, the router may be offering its control panel to a much wider audience than necessary. That creates more chances for password guessing, misuse, or other attempts to take control of the device. Remote management is sometimes useful in special situations, but it should not be treated like a harmless default feature. When it is turned on without a real reason, the router becomes easier to reach from places that should never have been given that chance. Even when remote management is genuinely needed, it should be handled very carefully and protected with strong credentials and good judgment. Beginners sometimes hear that remote access is convenient and assume convenience is enough reason to leave it enabled all the time. The better way to think about it is that remote management expands the attack surface because it gives outsiders a possible path to the most important settings on the network. That does not mean remote management is always wrong. It means the settings should be enabled only when the need is clear and the protection around it is strong enough to justify the extra exposure. A technician should explain this in very direct language. If the router can be managed from far away, then someone far away may try to manage it who should not. That one fact is enough to show why careless remote access creates avoidable risk. There are also a few supporting habits that make the main router settings work better over time. One is keeping the router's software current, because routers also receive updates that fix problems and improve security. Another is reviewing the settings once in a while instead of assuming the original setup remains perfect forever. In a SOHO environment, people often set up the router once and then ignore it for years unless the internet stops working. That is understandable, but it can leave the network behind on fixes and stuck with old choices that no longer make sense. A beginner does not need to become a full network administrator to improve this. It is enough to understand that the router is an active security device, not just a utility box. Checking for updates, reviewing who knows the passwords, and making sure old port settings or remote access choices are still necessary are all part of locking the environment down properly. As we close, the main lesson is that a SOHO router becomes safer when simple settings are handled on purpose instead of being left at whatever value was easiest on the first day. Default administrative credentials should be changed so the router itself is not easy to take over. The SSID should identify the network without giving away too much about the people or business behind it. Wireless access should be protected with a strong shared password so not everyone nearby can join. The firewall should remain in place to block unnecessary outside traffic. Ports should only be opened when there is a clear reason, and remote management should be limited because it can expose the router's controls to the outside world. None of these steps is flashy, but they matter because the router protects the whole local network. When it is locked down well, many easy and avoidable risks disappear before they ever get a chance to reach the devices behind it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.